Jesus, the carpenter, concludes his great sermon by drawing on ideas from his background in construction work. His last point is one of those things that you know, but you don't really know you know until someone points it out to you. That there's a connection between the place you live and the quality of your life. He puts it like this: anyone who hears my words and puts them into practice will be like a wise person who builds their house on a rock. The rains fall, the floods come up, the winds blow and beat against the house, but it doesn't fall because it's founded on a rock. And anyone who hears my words and doesn't put them into action, well, they're like a foolish person who builds their house upon sand. Now, for most of us, this text is so familiar that it's hard to imagine there being anything new in it, right? Christ is our ever-present support in times of trial. Rely on him. Build your life on him. As the psalmist says, the Lord is my rock and my fortress, in whom I take refuge, my shield and my stronghold. That's Psalm 18. Now, all of that is true. Of course it is. It just has nothing to do with what Jesus is talking about here. He isn't talking about his foundational role in our lives. The point isn't about him at all, really. It's about us. He's talking about the kind of life we choose to construct for ourselves, and whether we build it in a way that's suited to weathering life's hardships and trials. And for that, everything hangs on how we behave. Whether you fall apart in the face of adversity or whether you hold together depends on putting into place the kinds of practices that make your life stable and solid. As we end this series on Jesus' teachings about his kingdom and its connection with the happy life, let me make a couple of last observations. The first reads straight off the page. Your life is built. It is put together by you. And that constructive process consists of the decisions you make, the effort you put in, the things you prioritize, and the disciplines you develop. Not always. Some people are passive. They allow circumstances and fortune to determine who they become. That's a life built on sand. Others find themselves in adverse circumstances from the very beginning, and so never really get started building their lives. But in the main, our lives are made, and you and I are the ones responsible for making them. The second point is equally transparent, that not all ways of constructing your life achieve desirable outcomes. Some lives score really high on pleasure and adventure, but lower on relational satisfaction. Others might achieve financial or professional success, but maybe not as much in the way of fulfillment or inner peace. Simply to say, if you care about a life that's able to withstand the really hard moments, like surviving a trauma or a failure or violence or illness, you need to start with something that's stable. And that stability is found in a way of life. And that way of life follows a rule, a pattern, the features of which we've been examining in this series. I love this idea that the builder in the metaphor is building his house. Now, Jesus isn't, commenting on first century construction strategies. Obviously, the thing he's thinking about, the value he's addressing, concerns the kind of life you can be at home in. Because the point of a house is to make a home. So when he calls us to build our lives around certain practices, he's trying to help us find the sort of life in which you most feel you belong, where you have a place, where you can be yourself, where you can enjoy the community and communion with your friends, where you can be productive but also rest. Those are all hugely important things to our well-being and our flourishing. And to be most secure in possessing that sort of life, we should strive for a life in which that sense of home isn't vulnerable to the difficulties that life brings. We want a house that can endure, that can remain unshaken, come what may. And that requires developing a way of life that is resilient. I love Jesus' realism here. It's such a helpful corrective to so much of today's teaching around prosperity and positive thinking. Struggles and challenges and hardships and harms and failures and losses and infirmities and pains, they are inevitable. The question isn't if you confront them, only when. And if you've ever endured really difficult circumstances, which I know a lot of you have, you'll know that stability is nothing to sniff at. You'll know just how destructive things can be, to the point of shattering your whole world. What Jesus is saying is that there's a way of putting the practices in place that'll secure you against the trials of tomorrow. Not that you're immune from those circumstances, just that there's a way of living that will ensure you won't be destroyed. What are those practices? Well, the sermon is 100 verses long, so there's a lot to say, but we've made a brief start on examining some of them already in this series. You will be stable. You will be at home in the world if you live in a way that holds to the truth. Don't indulge fantasy. Don't embrace falsehood. Those things are unstable. Seek the truth in 4 ways. 1, the truth is that you are utterly dependent on God for all that you have and all that you are. That before your Maker, you are poor. You should adopt an outlook that acknowledges as much, and you should keep it always at the front of your mind. It allows you to be grateful for the big and the small things, and to be secure in knowing that your life is in the hands of an ever-loving God. 2, the truth requires that you mourn, because mourning is the appropriate emotional response to the truth of suffering. You need to do it. Otherwise, you can't register the truth of whatever it is you've lost, which means you can't move on. So mourn, not indulgently, but truthfully, and all the way to the end, until you can go forward anew. 3rd, you need to live in a way that understands the truth about your power, that you are able to make a tremendous difference in the world by the way that you act and the way that you live, by what you say and by what you do. You are powerful, and power is a responsibility, and being productive with it requires being responsive and obedient to the one who's making all things new. But to know God, to recognize God's guidance, you also need to be able to see God, which requires avoiding those things that pervert, obscure, and skew our vision. That's the 4th thing. Avoid things inwardly and outwardly that blind you to God. On top of that, your life will be strong if you seek always to act justly, showing to others what they are due, which is the same loving kindness that you would show yourself, because that sort of love is actually confident, loving yourself and your neighbor in right measure. And when you fail, acknowledge it and make it right. But when others fail, be understanding and merciful. That's the way that God treats us. It makes for a peaceful life. All of which points to something important about Christ's new kingdom. The culture he invites us to exhibit, the values and practices he recommends that we adopt, make for us a home in the world, both singly and as a community. It makes for a kingdom, a city on a hill, a place that's constructed by wise action on the model of Christ in conformity with his teachings. And it's a place of safety, of stability, of security and peace. Interesting that the happy life, beatitude, also turns out to be the one that is maximally secure. And that makes sense, I suppose. It's hard to be happy if you're insecure. My prayer is that together we would rededicate ourselves to the practices constituting Christ's kingdom, that we'd know the beatitude it offers, that we'd be secure in its happiness, and that we would be at home in the world. Thanks.